Mike Langford. Welcome to another episode of the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast. This week on the show, Pete Krull, CEO of Earth Equity Advisors, is with me for a truly inspiring conversation about sustainable investing. Now, I use that term inspiring not to be hyperbolic, but because when I think about the most basic, fundamental function of a financial advisor's role in their clients' lives, it's to help them have a vibrant and sustainable future. And as you'll learn from this conversation with Pete, sustainable investing checks all the boxes for the modern financial advisor's clients' lives. Okay, now, before we get to it, if you haven't done so already, please do make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Amazon, the YouTubes, or wherever you like to get your podcast jam on. And if you have a question or a suggestion for a topic or a guest, hit me up. I'm basically at Mike Langford everywhere, or you can send me an email, podcast@finservmarketing.com. Okay, let's get to the conversation with Pete Krull. Well, Pete Krull, wonderful to see you. Welcome to the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast.
Thank you, Mike. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to dig in and talk today.
I'm excited to dig in too. It's funny, every once in a while you get a guest where you're like, I am super interested in this topic just from me. Like, this is a selfish podcast from Mike Langford. I think our audience is going to get a ton out of it as well. But if not, I'm going to like this because I'm totally nerding out on this. We're going to be talking a lot about, yeah, exactly. We're going to be talking a lot about sustainable investing. As you might suspect, it's going to involve a lot of talking about things that are environmentally friendly, investing in that type of thing.
Yep.
But just tell you how nerdy I am about this. I literally have been watching on YouTube and listening to a corresponding podcast about this cross-country Florida to California journey these guys did in electric pickup trucks. So Cybertruck, Rivian, the new the F-150 Lightning, and then what is it? The Chevy's got a new one coming up.
Right.
So they literally drove coast to coast, and they did a race, basically who can get to, they cap the speed at 80 miles an hour or whatever. But it's really, I'll link it up in the show notes. But just so you know, I'm ready to nerd out on this.
I'm thinking or guessing who won that, but you can either spoil it or not. So
no, I'm not going to spoil it. Well, because each one of them had their own pitfalls, if you will, right? So their own challenges. Each one of them has their limitations and challenges. The new Chevy, as an example, has a monster battery in it, apparently, which allows it to go further than others on a single charge. But these guys weren't always topping it off, right? They were trying to implement like race strategies in terms of like how much. So,
well,
anyways,
and you've got really interesting. I mean, we're obviously jumping right in here, but you've got really interesting aspect of it is where do you charge? And which of those companies has got access to the best charging network?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So we'll nerd out further into this because we'll probably get into some of the stuff about electric vehicles and all that type of stuff here. But why don't we kind of give everybody a baseline a little bit?
Great.
Let's kick things off with your journey to sustainable investing, because your firm is Earth Equity Advisors.
Yep.
People obviously go, all right, that has something to do with being green and being sustainable. But why don't you share your journey, because I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So we'll go all the way. We'll go way back. How's that sound?
Get in the time machine. Let's do it.
Yes, let's do it. So my degree is actually in communication. It's not in business or anything like that. And I spent a little bit of time on the news side, realized that living on $12,000 a year was going to be rather difficult back in the early 90s. And so moved on. I did a little bit of retail work, grew up through a company called Sun TV and Appliances, which is no longer with us. They used to be based out of Columbus, Ohio. Worked my way up through that business from just a salesperson to director of corporate training, and ran a couple stores. When the writing was on the wall that they were going down, interestingly, the only company that's really left in that genre, because we also had Circuit City at the time.
Oh yeah,
the only one that's left is Best Buy.
Right.
So that's just a little interesting aside.
Yeah.
But so when I saw the writing on the wall, I reached out to my Merrill Lynch rep, who was in Buffalo, which is where I'm from, and said, hey, I'm interested in starting in the business. Can you get me an interview? And I was living in Roanoke, Virginia at the time. He got me the interview. I got the job, and that was in 1998. So that's where it started. I spent 5 6 years there. Did a real short stint in the bank channel, which I realized very quickly wasn't for me, and hung out my shingle with LPL. At the time, it was Krull and Company,
Okay.
and I had two real big influences on me at the time. Number one is Melissa, who is now my wife, but we were dating at the time, and she is a hell of a lot smarter than me. She has PhDs in microbiology and molecular genetics. And so we were having sustainability conversations, climate change conversations, and I was learning a lot from her. At the same time, I also had an opportunity to spend an afternoon with a gentleman named Bill McDonough. And Bill is or was probably one of the preeminent green architects in the world. He was, so far as like designing cities for China,
Oh, wow.
like really, really into sustainability. His book called Cradle to Cradle is sort of a tome for circular economy, or sort of the idea of eliminating waste from
Yeah.
from economies. And so I put those conversations with the conversation with Bill, all the conversations with Melissa together, hung out the shingle as Krull and Company, socially responsible investing. It's interesting. Sitting over there on my bookshelf is actually our original sign from 20
Oh,
years
cool.
ago that I still have, and that's where we started.
That's great. That's great. By the way, you have to send me a picture of that sign. We'll put it in the, we'll work it into
I
the
will. Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
video, we'll slice it in. That's really fascinating. So you were very early
Yeah.
to this space. I mean, not I mean, I think people were thinking green. Obviously, people have been thinking about being kind to the environment for a long time. But in terms of saying, "Hey, this is gonna be a fulcrum for our business," you were really early there. What was the part like so, obviously you felt some conviction there,
Hmm.
right? But what was I guess the aha or the whatever the light bulb going off that
Yeah.
says, "I can make this a real business. This is an area I can focus. This is a niche or community or whatever you want to call, however you want to define it. This is an area where I can focus on and actually have a viable business."
So I'm not sure there was an actual moment where I said, this is exactly where I made this determination, but there were a lot of smaller moments, and I can actually go back to like the early '80s in science fair projects. Two of my science fair projects, one was on solar energy and one was on wind energy. So I got an early start on this thanks to my brother who was really into it at the time. And so, fast forward a little bit, I'm at Merrill Lynch, and our trainer in the office, whenever the Calvert rep would come in, the Calvert wholesaler would come in, he would come to us after that meeting and be like, I really want to try this socially responsible investing thing. I think it's
Mm,
something we can do. And he was one of the top producers in the office, $1 million producer in the late '90s, which was, pretty decent. And he never followed through on it. It was something where he saw the opportunity, but it
yeah,
wasn't part of who he was. It wasn't his ethic. It wasn't how he was living his life. And so, I think fast forward a couple more years beyond that, having these conversations with Melissa, seeing the writing on the wall that we have to do something about, climate change being this existential crisis that we're all, now, 20 years later,
yeah,
realizing, damn, we should have started much, much earlier on making changes. I think that just being aware and being going into this eyes wide open and understanding that investing is about what's coming. It's not
yeah.
necessarily where we've been, and I think that was one of the keys to being able to get started 20 years ago. Actually, this coming June of 2024 is 20 years since I started it.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah,
exciting. It's really cool. I like that you mentioned the concept of, investing is about the future, right? I mean, I remember back in college when I was studying business and you had your accounting business and you had, excuse me, accounting classes, then finance classes. And the finance guys always tell you,
yeah,
listen, finance is about the future, right?
yeah,
It is not about where you've been, right? That's what accounting is, where you've been or where you are, right? What happened? Where are you now?
yeah.
And finances what's going forward. And when you think about investing, that is what you're thinking about. Like, hey, what's the world going to look like 20 years from now?
Something that's really interesting, I've talked about this a little bit lately, is that we've gotten away from investing in the future. We've really started
Yeah.
to be a lot more short term oriented. So, I started in this business about the time that the internet really took off,
Yeah.
and CNBC and all this like super fast data and quantities of data really started to come online. And we've transitioned, I think, from investing in long-term businesses to make them better.
Yep.
And instead, we're looking more at, I'll call it short-term speculation. We're seeing retailers come out with like weekly sales figures. You know, that is not a trend. What's going on for this week. But so much of the market movement is based on this short-termism,
Yeah.
and we've gotten away from really doing strategic planning, not necessarily for the next quarter or the next year, but we've gotten away from it for the next decade. And that's how good, strong, long-term businesses are built.
That's funny. I'm glad you brought that up because that's sustainability in a different way, right? It's not just environmental sustainability. It's
Yeah,
like, listen, is this business that you're investing in built to last, right? Or the activities that you're doing, in your life and in your portfolio, are they going to hold up for the duration, right?
yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
So one of my colleagues who runs the Green Alpha Funds, Garvin J. Bush, they use a term called next economy, and I like to use that term because that's how they position their ETF and their SMAs,
Yeah.
and we actually invest very very similarly to them, but it's really descriptive from my perspective. It is the next economy. It is where we're going. And when I look at sustainable investing in general, you know, the way I see it is that it is the definition of growth investing.
Yeah.
And I would challenge somebody to try and counter me on that, because the reality is our economy is moving into a cleaner, more resource friendly, more equitable kind of economy.
100%. It's kind of like do you think we're going to be using more electric stuff in the future or less,
Yeah.
right? Like, so for instance, people are transitioning to electric, battery powered lawnmowers, whereas before you're like, what? I'm never going to do that. Now you can buy a one that can, charge the battery, swap the battery out if you need to,
Right.
all that type of stuff. And once you get used to that, you're like, I'm never going back to a gas powered
Oh my
lawnmower. The
God.
stink, the smell, the pain in the butt of having to go to the gas station, fill up the tank, bring that gas can home in the back of my car, fill it up in the garage or whatever, and then store the gas tank in my garage, flammable a
Yep.
bottle of flammable liquid in my car unnecessarily, right? Or in the back of my garage, whatever.
Yeah, I haven't had a gas lawnmower in several years now. I've just
Yeah,
got the electrical. Now I don't exactly have a huge lawn either,
yeah,
so that's a good thing. But when I give my talks, one of the things that I like to give it as an example are these things right here, right? I grew up. We had the rotary dial phone. We have just come so far. I grew up using a VIC-20 computer. If you're old enough,
yeah,
you'll remember
Commodore.
it's a
Yeah,
5K of memory computer.
yeah,
What is that? 5,000 characters? Yeah, 5,000 characters.
yeah.
Um, and we would just come so far. And to say that we're going to continue to dig rocks out of the ground, light them on fire, to boil water, to turn turbines, to generate
That's
electric
right.
for us, versus what the opportunity is with solar or wind or even geothermal,
That's right.
which is a little more rudimentary but also clean, is just ridiculous. So the other example I use is, you know we used to believe that bloodletting would actually help you with your health, and now go into an MRI machine and we're in super high tech, or all of the genetic engineering and genetic medicines we have right now. You don't want to go back to those days.
No.
Why do we want to continue to use legacy generation techniques?
Yeah, yeah. And the old saying, like, some what is it? You can't get a man to like understand something if his livelihood depends upon on him not understanding it. As like, so
Right.
there are people in this country whose their lives are built on oil and gas and other old school
Yeah.
technologies, whatever. Understand that it's got to be scary and frustrating to you, especially since they might be like, "Hey, listen, I'm 50 years old. Like, I might not be able to transition to the green economy or whatever." So you understand why some people have some resistance, but
Yeah,
yeah,
and we have to be careful not to demonize that, because that is the energy source that got us to where we are.
Right.
And so we have to be grateful that they helped us get to where we are. But the reality is it's not the future. It's time to make that transition.
That's right.
We're seeing trillions of dollars that are being invested in the energy transition right now. And so when I look at this from an investment perspective, where do I want to invest my money? What got us here or what's taking us forward? I want
Right.
to invest in what's taking us forward.
That's 100%. So that's actually a great pivot, if you will, into something I want to make sure we cover here because, you know, one thing that people probably have noticed about me who listen to when they listen to this show or watch this show is that I have a bit of a opportunity mindset. I'm always thinking about like what's the opportunity, kind of as you were describing. So I look at the world through the lens of like what's the opportunity for financial advisors and wealth
Mhm.
management firms going forward, but occasionally we'll hit on a topic, and I suspect this may be one for some of the members of our audience where they get a little edgy, right? And some
Right.
of them will get a little edgy. Like, so for instance, I had Laura Gregg on from FlexShares ETF, and they did a study on DE&I, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we legitimately got hate mail. We legitimately got hate mail from people in our audience about that. Now, I would say, like, you didn't listen to the episode because we're
Right.
talking about this from an opportunity lens. We're not talking about, hey,
Absolutely.
you 50-year-old white guy advisor, your days are numbered. That was never like, it wasn't that. It was like, hey, listen, there is a monstrous opportunity of people who are different than you, different
Yeah.
gender, different, racial background, different, a whole bunch of differences that are looking to be served by financial advisors. And they may want to have an advisor who looks and sounds like them or has some shared background or whatever, or may want to work with a firm who has some of that representation or whatever. So we went into a whole bunch of that stuff, but every once in a while, somebody hears something and it triggers them a little bit. Now, some of it is based on myths they may have, right? Like when they think about sustainable investing or they hear ESG, they're like, no, no way. That's never going to make any money. You're going to kill my portfolio or whatever. So I thought maybe it'd be fun because I'm sure you've heard all of the myths. I'm sure you've heard, I'm sure you've
Maybe.
got your own hate mail.
I've
Oh,
never got hate mail, but I'm sure after this I probably will now.
yeah,
Thanks.
right. You're welcome. uh, so, what are some of the common myths that you may have seen amongst financial advisors as it relates to sustainable investing? So, what are some of the things you hear that people like who eschew it? If I
Yeah.
say,
So let's take a step back first and let's define sustainable investing. So
yeah, great idea.
before we get into that, so we've had a bunch of issues with communication over the last several years. We've seen the ESG, environmental, social, and governance, as a analytical tool rise. We have seen a lot of the big investment firms, mutual fund, ETF companies, sort of jump on the bandwagon, if you will, about investing responsibly or sustainably, however you want to say it. But let's define what ESG is. ESG is a set of metrics that look at risks on the company from those three outside metrics. So, environmental risk on the company, social risk on the company, and governance risk on the company. I think a lot of people think just the converse of that, that they think that ESG is the risk of the company on those outside forces, and
Mm,
it's not. So, when we look at this from an analytical perspective, as a fiduciary, as an RIA, we are sort of charged with having as much data as we possibly can to carry out our job, to make sure that when we put together a portfolio, we get the highest return for the lowest risk. And when we look at things like climate change, when we look at resource scarcity, when we look at the frequency and intensity of storms and all of these things that really come with ESG and governance, of course. I will, as a quick aside, governance shouldn't even be part of this. Governance should have always been a part of doing basic analytical research,
right.
um, a la Enron. But back to what I was saying. So ESG is a set of metrics based on risks on the company. But at the end of the day, it's not the portfolio itself. It's just a way to get to a portfolio. And so what we see often with the large fund companies is that they'll take a traditional index, they will layer on top of that ESG metrics, and they'll say, oh, this is your sustainable portfolio.
Mm.
but it's actually not a sustainable portfolio. It's a less bad version of the original index. And so, when we define sustainable investing, we define it as more intentional instead of just making it so that way there's less Exxon in the portfolio, for
Yeah.
example. I would much rather see for solar as a substitute. So when we look at sustainable investing, it's about solutions. What
Mm.
are the solutions for, as we were talking about earlier, the next economy? What are the solutions that are, going to take us forward into again, a cleaner, a more equitable, a more resource efficient future? So that's the first thing I'll
Mm.
say is that there's a difference between ESG, which is there's nothing wrong with it.
Right.
It's just a less bad version of the portfolio versus a truly sustainable portfolio, which is intentional and solutions based.
That's a really important clarification. Thank you for sharing that because to be quite blunt, that's the first time I've heard anybody describe ESG from that lens versus the way I've understood it. Exactly, I understood it the opposite, the way you were describing it. So it's the fact that this is a measure of the risk to the company
Yep.
versus risk to the planet, if you will, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And MSCI, who's one of the big providers of this data, is very specific about it, about how it's a risk on the company. And after years of a lot of murky communication when it comes to this,
Yeah.
companies like MSCI have gotten much better in terms of explaining what the
Mm.
intent of it is. Part of the problem, though, that when you start indexes once again are a reflection of where the economy was, right?
Mm.
And so it's really hard to index the next economy by looking in the rearview mirror, which is what traditional indexing is all about, right? And so, we're never going to necessarily correlate with the traditional indexes. Our tracking error is not anything that we actually focus on. And the reason is because, again, if you're trying to put a portfolio together that mimics an index, we're not going to have fossil fuels in the portfolio. So you're
Right.
starting off right off the bat with not having a sector in there.
Right.
There's going to be certain materials that we're not going to want to have in there as well. And so while you think it might limit us from a return perspective, which is, I think this is probably one of the myths you were talking about. I think it actually sets us up for future success because we're trying to eliminate the things that are the industries and the technologies of yesterday and replace them with the ones that are the industries and technologies of tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. I love it. Now, if you're thinking about a sustainable portfolio, does it require you to only be in green tech heavy companies? So
Yeah.
I imagine some people are thinking, yo, oh, okay, you mentioned for solar, maybe I want to buy, I'll use Tesla or, go down the list of companies who are making this new green tech stuff, the future revolution of stuff. Is that where 100% of my portfolio is going to be exposed to? Or is it, are we talking about a variety of different other sectors as well?
So the only sector that we don't so we have a portfolio called the Green Sage Sustainability Portfolio, which is an SMA and available at Prime Capital, where which is our parent company, but also it's available for licensing it as an SMA. It's on SmartX and some other platforms. But the only sector that is not in there is fossil fuel. Everything from communication to utilities, consumer defensive and cyclical, financial services, healthcare, et cetera. They're all in that portfolio. So it's interesting. Jeremy Grantham's company did a study a few years back, and they looked at what would happen if you extracted any particular sector out of the S&P 500, what impact that would have on the long-term returns. And they basically found that pulling any particular sector out of the S&P 500 had a negligible plus or minus difference on long-term performance. If you start to pull out more, then yes, you'll see a bigger impact. But pull any particular sector out, even technology is not that big uh, of a determining factor.
Interesting. Interesting.
And so when I just to give you an example, so when I put together this portfolio, there's going to be things that we do focus on,
Yeah.
Like the low hanging fruit is what I like to call 'em, like solar and wind, and other clean energy, battery technology, but things that you might not normally think about. So one of the industries I always like to talk about is insurance. So when we think about climate risk and we think about the one industry that could theoretically have the biggest impact on climate policy and how we go forward, it's the insurance industry, right?
Mm,
Because ultimately they're the ones who price risk. And ultimately, when a disaster hits, a hurricane, a wildfire, they're the ones who are going to be writing checks for it. And
yeah.
so it's interesting because the European insurers are the ones who are leading on this, which is not a surprise. But we've seen things like, California State Farm, and I can't think of the other one off the top of my head here, but we've seen insurers pull out of states.
Yeah.
We're seeing it in Florida. So that's one industry that we invest in the leaders who are actually building in climate risk into their underwriting policies. That's not something you would normally think about in a sustainable
Yeah.
portfolio. Likewise, I'm a huge fan of biotechnology because at the end of the day, a healthier populace is a more sustainable populace. And so if we can work to help make people healthier, that's also a sustainable strategy as well.
Yeah. It's funny you hit on the insurance thing. I was just having a conversation with my uncle who lives in Florida right now. And he was talking about how, like, some people are leaving Florida now because it's gotten too expensive
Yeah.
in general, because a lot of people move down there for cheap real estate and cheap retirement.
Yep.
But he's like, I go, "Well, what about you? Are you gonna stay?" And he's like, "I tell you what, if my home insurance keeps going up in price, I might be forced to leave." He's like, "We're paying like over $8,000 a year
Yep.
for our insurance." And I go, "Well, Ron, it's not gonna get any cheaper, right? You live in Florida. It's very susceptible to climate change risk, and insurers are pulling out. So now you're gonna have less pricing competitiveness. I mean, I know
Right.
it's a regulated industry, but at certain point in times, you may find yourself, because he's closer to the coast, there may be a scenario in which your insurance says, like, there's no insurance available for your home. You are just living
You're
at
gonna
your
have
own
to
risk
A
here.
lot of people are gonna have to self-insure, and
Yeah,
unless you're independently wealthy, you're gonna be thinking about moving, and what is that gonna do to your property value if you can't insure that property,
yeah. What's it gonna do
right?
for your mortgage, right? Like, part of the thing with the mortgage is, like, most lenders will not lend you money if you
Exactly.
can't secure insurance, right? Because they know that you're unlikely to be able to write a $1,000,000 check to replace the house, right? You're
Yep.
probably not going to do it. Anyway, let's shift gears to what I think is an inflection curve, and I think we've hit it, but I want to get your take on it. And because I live here in Austin, Texas, which is actually, believe it or not, one of the most electrified cities in America. I know Tesla recently moved their headquarters
Mhm.
here, but even going back, 15 years ago, before I moved here, I remember reading articles like, there's more EV chargers in Austin, Texas than there are in any other city in America. Now, that may not be true any longer, but they're like, you can't go to a parking garage around here without seeing
Yep.
EV chargers in the parking garage. So I kind of feel like maybe I'm in a fishbowl. We're a very green city, but have you seen an inflection point where and I know it's probably in your business, it's not an inflection point. It's been that way. You've designed the business that way, but are you seeing it like when you're interacting with the world, talking to advisors, like, are more clients coming in and going, "Hey, listen, sustainability is something that's important to me." So again, it's more of a demand side versus a push side where advisors are trying to, you know what I'm
Well,
saying?
for us, yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. So for us, because we only do sustainable investing, we're only getting those
Right.
prospective clients in. But I talk to a lot of traditional advisors as well because we do, like I said, license our products out. And because we license those products out, I get some pushback, but I also get a lot of questions as to, how do I engage with my clients? How do I engage with prospects on this? And let me just give you a couple statistics. So every about 2 years, I think it is, Morgan Stanley comes out with what they call their sustainable signals report, and it basically looks across the board at sustainable investing and demand especially.
Yeah.
And so this one came out, I think maybe in March, February, March of this
Yeah.
year of 2024. And so, they look at a whole bunch of different demographics and and whether they are either very or somewhat interested in sustainable investing. Millennials, so between 27 42, 96% are
Oh,
either
wow.
very or somewhat interested. My generation, Gen X, 91%. Surprisingly, Gen Z is only 85%. I think that will grow
It's probably because they don't have any
as they
money yet.
mature. That's a big part of it. That's a big part. They also don't have a lot of faith in institutions either,
It's
and so
true.
I think
Yeah.
that's part of it as well. So here's the thing: if you're a traditional advisor and you understand that over the next 10, 20 years, we're going to see this generational handoff of money. Who's that money going to? It's going to Gen Xers, it's going to millennials, and it'll probably go to some Gen Z.
Right.
If you don't at least understand or have a solution for that next gen investor, they're not going to stay with you. I mean,
Right.
Ernst and Young already has said that 70 to 80% of next gen investors change their advisor. That's already been
Wow.
established a couple of years ago in a study. So, what can you do to actually get ahead of that curve? Well, it's know what that next gen wants. And it may not be in alignment with what your personal values are, but that doesn't really matter at the end of the day. The only thing that matters is what the personal values are of your client. We've got a gentleman that I work with actually fairly closely, and he doesn't have the same political leanings as I do, but he understands that fact that he's got clients who specifically want to have sustainable investing, and we work really well together.
Yeah.
So instead of him trying to be the expert and tell the client or the prospect what about sustainable investing, he gets me on a Zoom and I do it for him. But you have to
Great.
have that arrow in your quiver. Otherwise, you're going to start seeing this next gen move on.
Yeah. No, it's 100%. And they may not tell you why they moved on, right?
Right.
They may just go, why do I have, Exxon in my portfolio? Why do I,
Mhm.
they might just start thinking, as they think about it and they look at it and like, my advisor's not having this conversation
Right.
with me. By the way, as I was thinking about this, you're mentioning like, an advisor hesitance because they're not 100% sure if their clients will be interested in it or whatever. One way to find out is, attend your local, Rivian meetup, the Tesla meetup or whatever, or as you're coming into your office, look to see how many EVs are in the chances are those people who are driving EVs, it's on their
Yep.
mind. They're not just
Yep.
buying them because they're cool cars and they don't have to, fill it with gas anymore, and that's more convenient. I'm sure that's a piece of it. Uh, I think it has a lot to do with, like, they care. They see this as
They
the
care.
future. They are thinking about the future, and
Those are the
so
early adopters, right? Those
for
are I
sure.
mean, the Rivian drivers right now are the early adopters. I mean, I've been
Right.
driving a Tesla for a couple of years, so I'm
Yeah.
not really, but I've been driving an EV for almost a decade.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm one of those early adopters. The I think we've hit somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% of new car sales are EVs. It's still a small percentage, but it is a rapidly growing percentage. Um, and one of the things you were talking about inflection points earlier. One
Yeah.
of the things that is going to be an inflection point in the EV race, if you want to call it that, is access to charging stations. Now,
Sure.
all of the major car manufacturers from GM to Ford, Mercedes, Rivian have decided to adopt the Tesla charging standard, an
Right.
ACS charging standard. Before that, there was sort of this mix of different providers.
Yeah.
The plugs were really clunky. Whenever you had to, whenever you went to charge, you had to get on your phone. You had to find where you were. You had to log in, and it would turn it on. And it just was this clunky process. With a
Yeah.
Tesla charger, you plug it in, it recognizes who you are, it automatically bills your credit card,
Right.
and it's typically faster than those other chargers. And so that is a huge inflection point as over the next year or two, these manufacturers adopt the North American standard, which is the Tesla standard. We should see adoption continue to rise
Yeah.
at a much faster pace as well.
Yeah. And it's funny, just another little note on that. It's like, this isn't a new thing. When railroads first came to be, there was not something called standard gauge tracks,
Right.
right? So what would happen was if you ship something from Austin, Texas to Dallas, they may have to the line might have just ended there, and then they would take your train stuff and go off that to go onto a different train because the tracks, they weren't the same width. So they would have to go from, and at some point in time, hey, we got to go to standard tracks.
Yep.
Now all the trains in America run on the exact same width track, so they can actually just take the car, put it on a different track, and let it go. And you've seen that in your life. Like right now, all our phones, right? With the new iPhone that came out, USB-C.
Yep.
Everybody's rocking that standard now. It's no longer, lightning, because at a certain point in time, we need standards. So we're in the early innings still of
Oh,
EVs, but it's
absolutely.
happening very, very quickly. So don't let that be a thing that dissuades you.
No, and again, we want to invest for the future. We want to invest for where we're going.
Yeah.
And one thing to keep in mind is during a value cycle, we're probably going to underperform because during value cycles, you're looking more at fossil fuels or traditional financial services or some other sectors that aren't necessarily built for the sustainability mindset.
Yeah.
But when I look at longer term trends, we're probably, and of course we can never guarantee performance, but we're probably going to see longer term growth trends versus value trends. And when those are happening, if you're invested in growth in the next economy, you're probably going to outperform during those times. Which,
Right.
when we look at this, we talked about long term business investing earlier. It's the same thing with investing in sustainability. You have to be in it for the
Yeah.
long term. And that's, I don't have a source for this particular data point, but as I was doing some research a couple weeks ago for my book, one of the things I saw was sustainability investors tend to focus more on the long term because they see that sustainability is the long game.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's like built into your psyche now. Think of, I want this to be sustainable. I don't want this my portfolio, the company where I'm investing, the technologies that I'm hoping or the solutions that I hope come to bear in life. I hope they're sustainable. I hope they're not frivolous and
Right.
disposable. Right, the opposite. So they're not short term.
And they taught real estate is one of the industries that or sectors that we have in all of our portfolios
Yeah,
because the real estate industry understands that when you make your buildings more efficient, more water efficient, more energy efficient, and even healthier, you can charge a little bit more for rent.
for sure.
You're going that investment, because again, it is an investment. It's going to take time to pay off, but at the end of the day, it's much better for your bottom line. And they know this. And when you look at pretty much any of the REITs out there, if you go to their websites, you're seeing, okay, we've got X number of LEED certified or not businesses, LEED certified buildings, or some other green standard, because they understand that it just makes sense. That big investment to put solar, to put insulation in, or whatever it is, flows directly down to your bottom line ultimately.
Yeah, on 100%. And it's like a lot of things you notice. We talk about the demand for that type of real estate. If you've ever gone to an old building
Mhm.
or an old house that has the old cast iron radiators, which we had when we were kids, pump the
Yep.
hot
I
air
love that heat though.
with an oil furnace, right?
Yeah.
But the houses were drafty. Why? Because they didn't have good triple pane windows and so forth. Like you
Yep.
just like things were. You'll notice the difference in quality, right? And then so going from one to the other, you pick up on it. Same thing as if you're getting to like an old diesel smelly car or whatever truck. You'll notice the difference between when you get into an EV. You're like, wow, this thing is quiet. Wow, this thing it smells doesn't smell
Yeah.
bad. All those types of things you notice, and you don't want to go back to the other things. Just like our lawnmower conversation.
And you're
Um,
like, oh my God, I'm going 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. That's pretty
is
cool too.
that's pretty neat too.
Yeah.
But one of the things I think you and I just kind of sort of tripped on here, and maybe this is part of your business and you're thinking this way, but we talked about early adopters and we talked about kind of the next wave, the Rivian shoppers like myself. I'm kind of in the market at the moment, doing my research. You These people are influencers, right? Like,
Right.
so you don't think of yourself as an influencer all that often, but if you are an early adopter type of person, very often your friends and family will be the ones who are asking you, "What do you think of that?" Like, I'm the first
Yep.
person in my cohort who got an iPhone as an example, right?
Yep.
People looking at me like, "Well, what's that? What do you do with it?" They wanted to see it. Give me, give me, give me. Let me see that thing. When we go to a family function or something. So if you have clients who are early adopters in a certain type of thing, a sustainable investing, and they're talking about it, and they're again showing up to work in the EV, and they're thinking that way, they are influencing other people in their
Yeah.
lives, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. My wife and I took a road trip up to Vermont a couple of years ago, and we were charging in a station in uh, deep southwestern Virginia,
Yeah,
which is typically not an EV kind of area, but there was an EV charger there. And we had a gentleman just come over and just start asking a whole bunch of questions. He
yeah.
was he was genuinely curious about it. He wasn't judgmental, which I thought was really a good um, sort of mindset for him. But he was genuinely curious. How many miles can you get? How expensive is it? How does it work? And so we see that all the time. I had a Prius early on, before we had EVs, and Prius is definitely a unique looking car. At
Yeah.
least it definitely was back then. But I felt that it was important not only from like the pure reason for owning it because it was more efficient, but also to show that, hey, if I'm going to do sustainable investing, if I'm going to be a leader in this business, I'm going to show that I'm putting my money where my mouth is, which is why we have solar panels on our house, which is why we have got batteries attached to them, and which is why we both drive. I have an EV and my wife's got a plug-in EV, so a plug-in hybrid.
Awesome. That's fantastic. That influence, if you will, the openness to be kind of the early adopter, it matters and it can affect your business. When you talk to most advisors, many of them will tell you most of our new business comes from referrals.
Right.
Well, what types of referrals do you want? You want future-minded referrals? You want younger folks, right? We talked about, it's, Gen X, or, we're still on the younger side.
Yes,
Uh,
we are definitely in the younger side.
I think
Don't
we
ever.
are.
Yes, I feel it at least some days.
That's right. I'm totally feeling young. Exactly. I worked out today. I'm looking good.
Oh yeah, you're making me feel bad. I didn't. So
So, but anyways, like we are the type of clients you want, right? The
yeah,
people who are oftentimes, especially the early adopters, they might be a little more affluent because they have the disposable income to make these types of investments. They're thinking about down the road. They again, as an advisor, you want a client who's future
yeah,
minded, who's thinking about retirement, who's thinking about estate planning, who's thinking about putting their kids in college and those types of things. This is your demo. You want
yeah.
these folks. Uh,
I think they're stickier too. I think
yeah,
those clients
probably.
are stickier because there's not a lot of competition for those clients. I mean, you've got us, you have First Affirmative, you have a couple other, bigger sort of nationwide kind of sustainable investing firms, but it's not like you got a Merrill Lynch in every town or Morgan Stanley or anything like that. So
Yeah,
those folks are typically, like I said, they're going to be more long-term focused, but I think that they're going to be stickier clients and you treat them right and you understand. So this is going to go back to what we talked about earlier.
yeah,
So understand what retail investors want. Retail investors don't want less bad ESG. So if that client or prospect comes to you and says, I want sustainable investing, and you buy them the BlackRock ESG Aware Fund and they get their annual report and they look at the list of holdings, they're probably not going to be very happy with you because they're going to see Exxon in there and they're going to see a bunch of other things that, McDonald's, they're going to be like, what is sustainable about McDonald's?
right.
Well, you can't answer that. So really understanding that the retail investor wants a solutions-based portfolio. Now that's a little bit harder on the financial advisor's part because you don't have as many of those kinds of options available. That's why we've started licensing ours because
Yeah,
there just wasn't a whole lot out there for other advisors to use. But keep that in mind because you don't want to bring that client in, go through that process, buy them something that really doesn't fit what they're asking for, and then have to come back and answer really difficult questions afterwards because you weren't an expert on it. Find the experts, work with the experts, and then service those clients.
yeah. I think we're getting past the days of just like, hey, I'm going to throw you in a few index funds,
Yeah.
and do that.
Especially in this, because I don't think you can index the next economy yet. You might be able to down the road some, but we're
Yeah,
just we're not there yet because it is a burgeoning industry,
yeah,
and not everybody agrees with they're not always going to agree with the specific areas that we focus on, but you have to at least have something that you can communicate with people about so that way they understand here's our sustainability ethos.
yeah, yeah. It's I could not agree anymore. It's so important that the client feels like their future is taken care of here. Um,
Right.
I want to shift gears to something, kind of skipping ahead, and I had this outline here, but I skipped ahead to.
I love to throw outlines off.
No, it's
So
fine. No, 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 no. They're conversation starters. By the way, anybody who's producing a show, who's doing a podcast, um, have your outline as conversation starters, but be
yeah,
willing to go down a different road because that's where the interesting stuff comes. But I want to jump into
yeah,
something before we go because I know we're getting close to the end of our time together. I want to talk a little bit about beyond the portfolio because you hit on something a few seconds ago here about advising the client and not having them go, "What the heck? Why haven't you been a good fiduciary thinking about my
mhm,
kid's future? I look at this ESG report or I look at this whatever, and like you've had me in all this crap for years." But I think most financial advisors, or many, are now going into legitimate financial planning as well. They're
right.
starting to look at a holistic view of the client's finances. So we're not just managing their stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, right? Or and recommending insurance policies or that type of stuff.
Mhm,
You're starting to look at like, okay, where should you invest your money for the future? That's many advisors have conversations about like, where should you retire? Like, if you're living in Boston,
right.
should you stay in Boston or should you consider Florida or Texas or some other no state income tax state? Or what is that right for you? So I wonder, like, if in your practice, and maybe uh, you do or you don't, or if you talk to other advisors, are you starting to have conversations and help them evaluate where to best invest for a sustainable living, a sustainable finances? Like, are you
Yeah.
making the recommendations for EVs and solar as you're describing and so forth? And then how do you go about helping them evaluate prioritizing those things? And which ones are the best choices because we're still again somewhat in the early innings of this stuff.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. I think you brought up a really good point. So I think it was Bloomberg that interviewed me sometime last year, and they ask about when you're working with clients and you're doing long term planning, especially for retirement. Does the climate readiness and resilience of a location come into play? And it absolutely should.
Mm,
So, for example, if we were talking about it, insurability in Florida and California earlier in the
yeah,
conversation, that absolutely is something that should come into play. Are you going to be able to insure that piece of property if insurance isn't there to back you up? Nobody wants to write a check because their house burned down and you didn't have an insurer. So that has to be a really important part of that. And you can, there I can't point you to a specific place to take a look at this, but part of it is common sense, obviously.
sure.
Hurricanes equal the Gulf Coast in Florida, fires equal, Mountain West and the West. There are places like Asheville, where I live, is considered a climate migration city
Hmm.
because that is where a lot of people are coming because we have ample water. As if you've seen it's gotten dark as we've been talking today. It went from sun to rain.
That's funny.
Um, they're looking at different things like that, access to food, those, all of these things are sort of tied together. Where I grew up, Buffalo, New York, is actually also considered a climate migration city, again, because of access to good, agriculture, access to water,
Yeah.
and some of the temperature changes, and not just climate or like actual temperature, but things like something called the wet bulb temperature, which is, as we're going to see in the tropics, is going to make some places almost unlivable
Yeah.
because of the heat humidity combo.
Interesting.
So that's certainly something that you want to be talking to clients about when you're talking about long-term planning. And if you're not talking about sustainable investing, you're really missing out on the sort of the long-term growth opportunities. So yeah, we absolutely have to be talking about some things that you may not normally consider to be material, but that are just as important.
Yeah. So smart. It's funny. I had a professor in grad school investments, Dr. Zvi Bodhi. Hopefully he's listening out there. Uh, he talked about risk a lot. And, people always talk about, oh, what's a long-term risk or whatever, or short-term. And he's like, listen, the long-term is just a series of short terms, right?
Right.
And so just keep that in mind. Right? The short-term risk actually can play out over the course of a long term. Like you just string a lot of short terms together. And one of the things he often talked about, it sticks with me, is timing and severity of risk, right?
Hmm.
And so you mentioned a little bit, if you're talking to your financial, excuse me, you're talking to your client about where they're going to retire and their retirement plans. you are actually, I think, almost have it in a breach of fiduciary duty if you do not talk about climate change or potential things that could happen to that area in retirement. And could they handle something bad going? Like, so if you're 75, 80 years old and a hurricane comes and wipes your house off the map and you had paid it off, but you weren't paying homeowners insurance because you couldn't get any. What does that do to your financial future? I mean,
Right.
luckily you're alive, but your stuff's gone and your house is gone and you got to go find another place to live. It's really important. What if you have to all of a sudden forget getting blown off the map? What if you're forced to basically migrate because
Absolutely.
I got to go?
I couldn't agree more that I think it's part of our fiduciary duty to do. It's no different than integrating ESG risks into analysis.
Yeah,
If you're not doing it, then maybe you're not necessarily living up to to the fiduciary standard, as
yeah,
opposed to some who would argue just the opposite, which makes no sense to me.
yeah.
Um, every data point that we can get that helps us to see a clearer picture of our clients' current investments and future financial lifestyle is valid.
Love it. Love it. Pete, this has been a fantastic conversation, but I would be remiss if before letting you go, we didn't talk for at least a minute or so about your podcast. You have a new
Oh,
show called
yes.
Dollars in Change. And by the way, the double entendre for the dollars in change is real. I love it. I love it. And here's the thing. Your first guest was Ed Begley Jr., who's
Yes.
Hollywood actor, also a long time climate activist in his own. And I highly recommend everybody go to your website and we'll get that all linked there. You can see the first episode, your interview with Ed. But I want to just give you a chance to kind of tell the story about how that came together. And because I think for advisors who are listening are still with us here, there's an opportunity for them to meet some of their own influencers. It
Mhm.
doesn't have to be on the caliber of somebody like Ed Begley Jr., but following up and getting these people in your circle to talk about these things that are important to your clients or to your target audience is just hugely important. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing that.
Oh, absolutely. So I met Ed in 2009. We were in Wilmington, Delaware, and there was a green expo
Yeah.
going on there. And so I was a speaker, Ed was a speaker, and the organizers, in their infinite wisdom, decided to have us both speak at the same time. And so when I was speaking about sustainable investing, I had two people in the room, and Ed was talking about his TV show, Living with Ed, at the time, about living environmentally friendly. He had 200 people. And so I went up to him afterwards, and we joked about that, and then we sort of stayed in touch on and off after that. And so I was heading out to the Future Proof conference. Anybody who hasn't been a Future Proof, by the way, it is an absolutely awesome financial services conference in Huntington Beach every September. I'll be heading out there again this year. Anyway, so I was heading out to LA. And I sent him a message. Or I'm linked up through his wife, who's also an actress on Facebook. I
Yeah.
said, "Hey, I'm going to be in LA. Would you guys like to get together and talk about sustainable investing?" And she says, "Yeah, let's do it. I'm going to be out of town, but here's Ed's phone number. Give him a call."
Yeah.
So I give Ed a call. He calls me back. We set up a time. I go in, and I was bluntly honest with Ed. I was like, Ed, I didn't really have an agenda when we set this up. He says, but my marketing folks, we're starting a new podcast, and I would love for you to be my first guest. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he's like, Pete, I would love to do that for
That's
you. When do you
great.
want to do it?
Yeah.
I said, how about now? And we recorded it. We sat at his kitchen table, and it was such a fun episode to do because, I don't have a ton of connections with Hollywood
Yeah.
or folks like that, but Ed is the guy that you'd be sitting next to in the bar, just shooting the breeze with.
Yeah.
He's so real. Passionate about sustainability, passionate about environmental advocacy, and just he's somebody who you can be friends with, not see him for 10 years or whatever,
Yeah.
and then just pick right up like that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm glad you shared that story because again, not everybody's going to go out and get Ed on the show, or maybe he's going to go a whole bunch of inbound now. Like, please be on my podcast. Bye. But I think that's so important because look, if you meet somebody who's advocating for a certain thing that your audience, your target market, if you will, also cares about, chances are they're going to be open to joining
Yeah.
forces a little bit. Right now, they may have some constraints on their schedule or whatever, but I love the fact that you were just like willing to, hey, want to be on the show, and he said
What
yes.
what's the worst case scenario? He says no,
That's right.
right? It's just it's one of those things. I to plug the podcast a little bit. It is
Yeah,
it's on YouTube, and it's also on the Apple Podcast, Spotify,
yeah,
all that fun stuff as well. But it's geared towards financial advisors, just like you are.
right.
And so the people I interview are people in the industry who are leaders in sustainable investing, and we talk about different things like their journey to go from being a traditional advisor into sustainable investing. Jeff Gitterman out of New York, we had a great conversation, and I learned so many interesting things about him. I've known Jeff for years, but he was telling me stories that were just unbelievable to me, but they were really helpful, I think, for a traditional advisor to say, "Hey, here's how I could integrate this into my practice." Sam Adams with Vert Green Real Estate investments. We talked actually about retirement plans because
Wow.
one of the important part. He's on the Plan Sponsor Council of America, I think, is what he's on. But we talked about the importance of trying to get a sustainable option in as many retirement plans as possible. Why do you want to do that? Because what did we say earlier? 96% of millennials have an interest in it. 91% of Gen Xers do. 85% of millennials. That is pretty much your entire working age demographic right there. If you don't have something for them, and this he was telling me about this, what they're seeing is that millennials especially are opting to not use their company retirement plan if there's not a sustainable option in there, and investing their money in taxable accounts. What
I,
does that do? They lose out on the tax deferral and they lose out on the match. But because they don't have an option, they are going elsewhere for it.
it's
And
nuts.
so
It,
just throw one option in there.
just so
Make
one,
sure it's a good one.
I
Make
love
sure it's
this.
not a less bad one. Just put one in there.
I tell you what,
Speaking
go ahead, go
Speaking
ahead.
of which, we'll have a CIT out soon
Yeah.
to make that easier for you. So stay tuned for
I
that.
absolutely. I tell you what, I co-sign that as one of our clients is a large provider of retirement plans for Texas school systems, and the participation rate of teachers and staff in school systems is frighteningly low, right?
Yeah,
And one of the hard parts here in Texas, land of freedom, is they don't want to implement a automatic enrollment
right.
for people. So when they get a job, they're automatically enrolled in the 403B or whatever, because people see that as an assault on their autonomy and their freedom or whatever. Just kind of boggles my mind. By the way, you can opt out. Why not just make them automatically
Yeah,
opt in and then tell them they can opt out? Give them the freedom to do that. But I
it's
love
only
it.
in their best
Yeah,
interest.
it's only in their best interest. And also, by the
Yeah,
way, if you made it, like you said, a sustainable option there, you might also juice participation. So fantastic. I
and that's one
absolutely,
of the interesting things about the DLL rule
yeah,
is that one of the aspects of it that Sam told me about is that if if you put an option in there that helps you to increase participation rates, it makes it's just one of the further good reasons
yeah.
to have it in there.
Exactly. And you were talking about sustainable.
Hello?
You know what's sustainable? Having people who reach retirement age actually have retirement income available
Yeah.
to retirement savings available. That's a sustainable thing. So, I don't know, just think about it. Anyways, listen, Pete,
Food for thought.
this has been absolutely fantastic. I love having you on the show. And honestly, I think you'll be back on the show at some point in time because we've really hit it off. Good stuff.
I would love to. I mean, this has been an hour already.
Yeah, we cruised, dude. It was
Wow.
great. So earthequityadvisors.com is the website. We'll make sure we get that linked up. We'll get other contact information linked to the podcast and some of the other references you dropped on the show. Thank you very much for coming on. This has been great.
It has been an absolute pleasure. And again, time flies when you're having fun. And I'm not ready to sign off. I'm ready to keep talking.
There we go. Well, we can click stop recording. You and I can keep talking after. It's great. Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to and or watching this episode of the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. It's always fantastic to have you with us. Huge thanks to Pete Krull for sharing his insights on how advisors can meet or exceed the needs of the clients of today and tomorrow. Okay, that's all I have for you today. please make sure you do something to make the world a better place. We've had this whole conversation about sustainable investing. Go do some stuff for the future. And be nice to each other. We'll see you next time on the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast. See ya. Bye.